I'll start off by audio describing myself. I'm a woman with medium brown hair. I'm wearing a quite uninteresting black top and have the bright pink Accessible Arts logo in the background behind me. I do apologise in advance if there is some background noise. My guide dog has decided to have a sleep right next to me and she's snoring away at the moment. So I do apologise if you wonder what that background noise is. I would also like to recognise the traditional owners on the respective lands on which we all meet today and acknowledge their past, present and future leaders. I personally acknowledge the owners of the Cammeraygal lands and people from where I currently speak with you today. Today's presentation is being live captioned and you can turn this on, or we also have 2 interpreters with us and you can pin these or them to your session as well. You're welcome to submit questions during today's discussion using Zoom's Q&A function. If a question is pertinent to a specific panelist, please indicate who you would like to respond. During this afternoon's session, we will be discussing how our media industry is responding to making content more accessible and inclusive. What are the latest developments in technology? And is disability representation improving across roles such as journalists, broadcasters and producers? And if not, what needs to change? The impressive bios of our panellists today have been published on the Accessible Arts website. I won't go into these in detail right now, as I believe our esteemed panellists will introduce themselves and their backgrounds during their presentation as well. But today we are joined by Naz Campanella, Disability Affairs Reporter, ABC, who has found time to join us during a particularly busy day. And unfortunately, Naz will have to head off at 2 p.m. So if you do have any particular questions for Naz, please enter these in the Q&A section and we will attempt to address these before Naz has to leave us. We're also joined by Sancha Donald, who is the General Manager of Radio 2 RPH and former CEO of Accessible Arts. I'm not sure if Anthea has joined us yet. We are expecting Anthea Williams, who's director, writer and broadcaster and also works with Sancha at Radio 2 RPH. I can't see her online at the moment, but hopefully she will be able to join in as we proceed. We're also joined by Michael Cooper, who is the Head of Regulatory and Government Affairs at SBS. Each panellist will speak for a brief period, and I believe Sancha has a PowerPoint presentation for us to enjoy, and Michael will also be showing us a video presentation which demonstrates the use of both audio description and closed captioning. First up, I'd like to introduce Sancha Donald to speak with us and share insights into her experience and her views on where media inclusivity and access sits today and what steps particularly Radio 2 RPH has been taking to provide education for the broader media sector and also to provide accessible content for people with disabilities and print disability particularly. Sancha, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Jackie. And I just want to share my screen. I hope that everybody can now see that. I'll move through what will probably be a very dry presentation compared to what Michael is going to share with you, the little snippet that I saw. However, firstly, I would like to just mention that I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people. So just adding to Jackie's acknowledgement of the traditional owners, I'm based in Glebe in Sydney, and that is Gadigal land. Just to describe myself, gosh, in all the times that I was at Accessible Arts, in fact, I don't actually think that I had to do this, but I am of, I guess I'm on the short side, blondish hair, I'm wearing glasses, but more interestingly, I have a logo board behind me, which is, says 2RPH, and I have, for those with eagle eyes, you might be able to see what looks like a football, but it is actually a digital radio. That's an older style digital radio, but there's also a slightly more boxed version next to it, which is a current version. Just in terms of my background, I have worked in the disability and the disability affiliated services for some time. But I became interested in the disability field during my time as a sports manager, actually, at Sydney University and in the international arena of sports management. At some point, I decided to activate my interest in the arts, but at the same time became very aware through my knowledge of sports management that the landscape for people with disability in the arts was very different. The opportunities were very different from what they were in the sports landscape. And this is going back many, many years. But this led me to be able, fortunately, to be able to combine my interest in the arts and my knowledge of disability. And so, yes, I worked at Accessible Arts for many years, and more recently, joined Radio 2 RPH, which is a community radio station, and we have our core listenership are people who are blind and low vision, although that has broadened enormously even in my time. So I'm just going to give a rundown of, I guess we are the case study in terms of how we have adapted to this COVID environment. And I'll just share some insights though as to what I think it's meant for us and society in general in relation to inclusivity and where the blockages might be. Now, first problem. Why isn't that? Aha. Okay, so just very quickly for, to run through the service, because some of you may never have heard of us. So we're a radio reading service, and what that actually means is that we are not a music station, we're not a talkback, nor do we have any shock jocks as part of our volunteers. But we aim to educate, inform and enable and entertain our listeners, and we do that through reading. Everything that we do until up to date, I must say, is reading major newspapers, international and Australian magazines. We read books, we read from websites now, and so it's generally, we work with published material. In terms of our programs, we have 225 program slots a week that we need to fill, and 31 of those are live to air. We have 100,000 listeners a week. And so who are our listeners? So I mentioned those who are blind or who have low vision, but it's really broader than that. It's anybody who cannot or doesn't want to actually access material independently. Maybe they have difficulty handling material, or they might have difficulty understanding printed word. And our audiences really fall into 4 categories. The traditional, which is older, those who are blind, those who might be hospitalised or housebound. But we have an enormous number of people that are time poor. They could be commuters, shift workers, busy parents, or those who drive for a living. We have a very large number of listeners who need language support. And an example of that are people who are recovering from stroke, people who have low levels of literacy, and we have many students, non-English speaking students, who sit with the newspapers, if you can find one these days, sit and listen to us reading a newspaper, and they're following the words there. So, and people who have cochlear implants, learning what that sounds like. And then the last group, which is we term emerging, and that's the homeless, financially conscious. If ever you, I don't know when the last time you bought a newspaper was, but they're actually quite expensive these days, and they're diminishing in size. So, you know, we're finding more and more people who are listening to us now for that reason, and they're geographically isolated. Our 200 volunteers, active volunteers, but they themselves posed a problem, not a problem, but we needed to solve a number of challenges with them because they're the ones who read and record for us. But of course, many of them have comorbidities. And in this time of COVID, that's a real risk. Or they could be living with someone who has a comorbidity, or they're caring for an elderly parent. So this was, you know, it's been a real challenge for us. We're 24/7 service, and we broadcast across Sydney and Newcastle, and soon Wollongong. So how did we respond Okay, so we very quickly, like about a day, came up with our key principles. And our key principles were that we would remain on air. That was non-negotiable. And it was non-negotiable because of who our listener base is. It was essential that they would still receive all of their normal information, but any government information and health information that was going to be promoted through airwaves. And many of our listeners only listen to 2RPH. And we're quite proud of the fact that we were able to remain on air because many community stations had to close down, certainly for a time. The second principle was that volunteers, they were to be able to contribute. And that actually can translate for people with disability as well. It's a topic for another day, but you will all know people over 60 who are actually told to stay at home, to even teachers, and decisions were made for them, and so quite ageist decisions, and quite ableist decisions were made as well. And so for our volunteers, we said no. If they wanted to continue to volunteer, it was important to their mental health. We wanted to make all of our changes in the light of the future. We wanted really to spend no resources or time on any changes that we were making that wouldn't carry on and be part of our normal mode of operandi in the future. There was no going back. We just knew instantly. And interestingly, in the UK, an organisation, Disability Arts Organisation, has put out a resource, and it's called Not Going Back. And this has provided our strength to us. So they were our sort of principles, of course, along with, no transmission at the station. We very quickly as well ensured that as much disability content could be included in our regular programs. We'll come to our disability specific programs later, but in our regular programs, if there was a choice to be made, and there's always choices in terms of what we read from, let's say, a daily paper, that we would read a higher percentage of health, COVID and disability related material to ensure that our volunteers, our audience felt that, they were being still informed in this odd time. So in terms of adapting, well, this was the area of panic, I suppose. And I mentioned that we have live to air reading, 31 live to air reading sessions a week. But if any of you have seen a broadcasting studio, they are quite small. We have 3 people in a studio at any one time. Remember that they're volunteers who are generally older, and the nature of what they do is performative. And that is the thing that's affecting live performance worldwide still today in terms of COVID. So we very quickly had to come up with a solution. So we reduced the number of presenters, and fortunately we had upgraded our technology, which meant that we were able to separate out the announcer and the reader across different studios. Not easy if you're one of the presenters, but that's what enabled us to continue. I do need to also emphasise that the studios, of course, are pretty airless and very limited ventilation. So all of the things that we read about now, we have 3 of those boxes, and it was just like that was the Petri tray. So we then very quickly, we have restored shifts, but we had to reduce them, and we're trying to go forward with the virtual environment. Reading from home has become an enormous focus for us. Up until COVID, all of our volunteers came into the station to record their programs that might either based on the magazines. So the newspapers are live to air, and all of the magazines that we read, from the Women's Weekly through to the New Yorker and everything in between, The Economist, were recorded in the studio. Well, we very quickly realised that we wouldn't be able to continue if we didn't facilitate many of our volunteers operating from home. And so we applied for a grant with the City of Sydney. We were fortunate to receive that, and that gave us funding. We developed guidelines. We tapped into the resources that we realised that we had within our group of volunteers, and we may not have known that before, so that's been a real strength. We developed a partnership with a training organisation within our sector, and we've rolled out a series of trainings for beginners, middle and advanced pre-recording. We've also been able to purchase equipment, headphones and microphones, and they are now in the homes of many of our pre-recorders. You know, that's going to go forward. So that's what I mean. That's an example whereby we're not going in the future to recall them all into the studio, and that's opened up lots of possibilities. We have as much personal protective equipment as any other organisation does now, from shields, you know, face shields to perspex, but that will enable us to bring our audition process back online, our interviewing process, and our training in a safe way. The opportunities that have come to light have been enormous for our organisation. What it's meant is that we've realised that our volunteers can continue on, where often in the past, when they were downsizing, going into a retirement village, they would often, you know, have to relinquish their volunteering role here just prematurely, because they were moving perhaps a little bit too far away. Now that's not going to happen, and they can continue to provide information and media to our listenership for as long as they want to. It's opened up our ability to tap into guest readers. It's opened up our ability to tap into regional readers, which we would never have done before. Global English-speaking presenters. There's nothing to stop us now receiving programs from around the world and adding to the lineup of interesting programs that we offer our listeners. Ultimately, it will also lead to greater diversity of presenter, and it's this area that is going forward the exciting area as well for us. That's where we can do a lot more work than we've been able to do up until now. So the future, well, the future, my version of the future is that there is no post-COVID. It's really, I think, important, and yet I think this is the great story. Mankind has adapted. We have absolutely adapted to this situation, and I think that's the great story to hold on to. There is no post-COVID for, in my view, a whole range of reasons. And one, the vaccine, you know, will need universal and global adoption, and we don't know how often we would have to have it, and we know that COVID's already mutated and all of those things. But there's already been behavioural changes. I'm sure you all know people that have relocated. And there's going to be continual hotspots for some time. And we can see in Europe what is happening, and again in America. So the good story is that this has, in my view, shone a light on accessibility like never before. And I can only encourage all of you who have access in your title or in your duties, or it is what you want to do, to really seize this moment, because this moment will start to shrink. And you are pivotal in your organisation to really invest in radical access and empowerment, choice of control, and to see that home delivery of services and decentralisation of the working environment and of entertainment as positives. We can already see how our society has changed so much with the uptake, let's say, of virtual communications. And I mean, how good is the improvement in augmented reality? You can now try on clothes through Gucci and Farfetch And you can try them on. You don't have to go to the shop, and you put the watch on your wrist and you can see what it looks like. I mean, how good is that? In terms of media inclusion, or media inclusive as I have on the screen, I'll break this down into a couple of areas. One is the audience. Of course, we need to consult and with our audience, with people with disability, and and co-design. That is essential. And that group of people with disability is much larger. Those people that are going to isolate for a lot longer, we need to bring them into the equation, because we need to recognise, of course, that access to media and information is, you know, it's a human right, and it's a matter of equality and justice, just as many other endeavours are. In terms of self-representation, I break that down in, well, no, in terms of self-representation, we, I guess, are going to talk a little bit about portrayal of disability, telling the stories that we want to tell, telling them the way they need to be told, including people with disabilities in a story if they're not able to represent themselves. The challenges, the digital divide. What I have realised through this process is that we really have to invest in capacity and confidence, capability and connectivity for the end user. There are wonderful things out there, but I have learned that so many people will say to me, oh, I'm not capable, oh, I'm not confident, oh, the technology didn't work, oh, my computer's broken. And this is no way forward. So I would emphasise that. I would also emphasise the need to have affordable technology. Much of it still needs to be free, and you shouldn't have to download or subscribe to everything. Those platforms can bring fantastic results and information, but not everybody wants to do that. The challenge is also that media itself is a disrupted space. This provides opportunity, but we do need to recognise that it's disrupted, its financial model is often disrupted, it is disrupted in terms of technology. Even the lifestyle of a journalist can be a very disrupted lifestyle. So it's really important to recognise that journalism, there's citizen journalism, all sorts of things disrupt that landscape, and we have to be able to work within it and across it and recognise that. The last challenge is also resistance. There's institutional resistance to change in any sector, and the arts and the media are no different. It has its institutional barriers as much as any other sector, and so we need to work around that, identify those and work around those. And you will also have in your own workplaces as well people who are just resistant to change, and so you need to find people that are up for invention and innovation and creation. This takes me to the last slide, and that is that we, through this process and a little bit before, recognised that we needed disability-specific programs. And so we have been working to create content. When I first arrived at 2RPH, I pretty quickly realised that it was a great service to the listener, but much more needed to be done in terms of developing disability content and presented for and by people with disabilities. So we have gone about developing a suite of 4 programs called Platform, and one of those programs is called Activated Arts, which I'm very pleased to say we're partnering with Accessible Arts in, and perhaps Anthea is going to join us to talk more about that program. But what is essential and good about developing that partnership is that we've got a little bit of money to pay a person, so there's employment. We are employing a person with a disability in terms of Anthea, And we're also streaming it. It's on demand. We're podcasting it, and we're also syndicating it across Australia. 2RPH is actually a member of a national network of radio stations of a similar persuasion, and so we share our programs across Australia. So I think I've covered the content, framework and element of activated arts, and that pretty much takes me up to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Sancha. Certainly a comprehensive presentation, and as questions popped into my head, you proactively answered them, so thank you for that. I know we have a couple of questions in the Q&A for you, but if you're comfortable, we might leave those till the end of the presentation and then come back to that. I haven't been able to connect with Anthea, so I'm just wondering if, Anthea, you are there. I can't see you on the participation list. If you are there, if you could unmute yourself and let us know. Don't think we have Anthea with us. I also note there's been a few challenges with people pinning the interpreters. Has that been addressed yet? I'll just check the chat function. Okay, I'm going to presume, because I haven't seen any more in the chat or Q&A function at the moment, I'm going to presume that everyone's now able to access the interpreters. And as we don't have Anthea with us, we might move on to Michael. But it was great to have that brief overview, Sancha, from you about activated arts. And if we have some time at the end and Anthea hasn't been able to join us, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit further background on that, that would be great.
Okay. I'm sorry, I think I was a bit longer than my 7 minutes.
Well, actually, it worked well seeing we don't have Anthea, so it's fine. I didn't have to get creative, so thank you. Okay, so we'll now move on to Michael Cooper from SBS, and he's the Head of Government Affairs and Regulation at SBS. Michael's had quite a bit to do with the introduction of audio description within SBS, and he'll give us an overview of what SBS is doing in the access and inclusion space, but also give us a good background, I understand, into what audio description is and how we can all benefit from it and incorporate it into our practices. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Jackie. Yeah, so I'm Michael Coonan, Head of Regulatory and Government at SBS. That's a role I've been in for about 4 years. Prior to that, I was in subscription TV for a little while and at the regulator, the ACMA, for a number of years. So I'm sitting in my home today. This is the first time I've audio described myself, so this is novel. I'm in front of a beautiful piece of First Nations art from the community at Utopia in the Northern Territory. I think it's safe to say I'm a 40-something, definitely safe to say that, white man. I'm wearing black and green and glasses. And I'd also like to build on the acknowledgements of First Nations people by saying that I'm acknowledging the Wangal and Cadigal people who are the custodians traditionally of the land that I'm on in Sydney today, and also pay my respects to the First Nations people of the land you're on today. So as mentioned, I recently led the introduction of audio description at SBS, which I'm keen to talk about today, as well as mentioning how we're making content more accessible in other ways, such as obviously closed captions, but also by subtitling our commissioned content into a range of languages other than English. So we know that this year, as Sancha covered, has been unique in so many ways. Trusted, continually updated news and information in a range of languages has been really essential to navigating the health crisis. Earlier this year, SBS Radio launched a COVID-19 news portal, and we did that in 63 languages to reach our multilingual audiences with that really continually updated information. That's now been accessed by more than 5 million Australian unique visitors. And SBS World News, which is of course captioned for the deaf and hearing impaired audience, has also been very important, particularly providing both local and global perspectives on the crisis. But first I'd like to talk in a bit more detail about audio description. So I started working on audio description a number of years ago when the government convened an AD working group with both broadcasting and community representatives. And the relationships that we built through that process have been really central to the successful launch of our service. So I imagine most people in the audience are familiar with what audio description is, but just to recap, It's a service that provides the auditory narration of the non-verbal elements of a TV program. So during gaps in dialogue, it describes visual elements such as facial expressions and scene settings. And I've got a clip later which will give some great examples of facial expressions. We launched our AD service in July this year, and that was after beginning a trial in April, which we used really to test the functionality, like down to basic things like turning it on and off on different TVs, and to fine-tune content selection. It's a project I'm personally really proud of, and I know colleagues across the business have found it a really rewarding experience. And central to that has been our engagement with the community, and particularly our audience testing process, which was led for us and for the ABC by the Centre for Inclusive Design, who've been outstanding partners. We know it's a service, audio description, that the community had been anticipating for some time, and we, along with the ABC, were obviously very grateful to receive dedicated funding, a grant of $2 million each from the government, announced in December last year to launch the service by July this year. At SBS, it's operating across the SBS main channel and SBS Viceland, with a range of docos, dramas and movies being audio described. And those are the genres that have the most non-verbal material to narrate. So that's sort of relevant to how we select the content. So we love it, and we have loved being able to audio describe the Australian shows that SBS makes, as well as obviously a lot of content we acquire from overseas. And some good examples of that this year have been Who Gets to Stay in Australia. I know a number of you may listen to Vision Australia Radio. Matthew Leighton interviewed the producer of that program earlier in the year, which covering both, the content about migration, the visa process, as well as the audio described aspect. And I know Santa mentioned homelessness. We also audio described this year the latest series of our program, Filthy Rich and Homeless. And that was series 3, and that's coming up again. It's being repeated with audio description in November. But I wanted in particular to mention our recent drama made in Melbourne, Hungry Ghosts. So this is a story that centres around the lives of a number of Vietnamese Australian families and looks at their experience of the Vietnam War and migration to Australia, as well as some supernatural activity around the Festival of the Hungry Ghost. For us, it was a really exciting piece of content, both in its own right, but also because it was one of our most accessible pieces of content ever. We audio described it, we closed captioned it, and we also subtitled it into Vietnamese, Simplified Chinese and Arabic, joining a range of other programs in our Chinese and Arabic collections like Insight and The Family Law. So when we launched in July, we started doing 14 hours per week of audio described broadcast content, and we expect through the rest of this financial year to be able to increase that to 16 hours per week, and from next financial year we aim to increase that to 18 hours per week. The other thing I really wanted to highlight in relation to audio description is how much we've gotten out of working collaboratively with the community representatives led by Blind Citizens Australia. So the co-design process meant that we could really identify issues and work on addressing them together with both SBS and the ABC at the table to try to ensure as consistent and offering across the two networks as possible of audio description. Some good examples of that include some instructions that we developed. SBS Technology put those together, testing a range of TVs, how do you turn it on and off. We also worked with Wayne Hawkins at ACAN there to get the best of his team's knowledge on that as well, and to combine that and to duplicate those instructions on the SBS and the ABC websites. We developed a chime, which if we do get the video going later on, we'll hear at the start. It's an audio cue to let people know that the program they're about to watch on broadcast has audio description in it. Again, that's used on SBS and the ABC. And for SBS, we worked with Blind Citizens Australia to put an audio recording of our weekly audio description program schedule up on the BCA phone line. So it's a toll-free number people can ring and they can hear what's coming up that week. Again, that was iterated in consultation with people who had experience, for example, of using a similar service at Sydney Opera House. And we were really able to make it sort of work the best that we could. And in coming weeks, we're working with Blind Citizens to distribute, Blind Citizens Australia to distribute a large print Braille embossed postcard to BCA's members, which promotes SBS's AD service and ways to access it. So turning to accessibility more generally, I mentioned subtitling, of course, being the multilingual broadcaster, and we did more than 6,000 hours of that last financial year at SBS. But for deaf and hearing impaired audiences, closed captioning of English language programming is obviously very important. We've been captioning for a long time, and so we have a significant number of hours annually on the SBS main channel in particular, as well as captioning on SBS Viceland and SBS World Movies, as well as NITV. We know today's a perfect example how important Auslan interpreters are at key live news conferences, and especially during the bushfire and COVID crisis this year. So I know that an important consideration for our access services team has been to ensure that the captions are not overlaid on or do not otherwise obscure Auslan interpreters at press conferences. We're working through the results also of a review of the accessibility of SBS On Demand. We know we have work to do there. The desktop interface was recently relaunched, and a good example is through feedback, we tweaked the hero content carousel at the top to make sure that it worked. It was optimised to work with screen readers. SBS as an employer, so we're working on making SBS a better place to work for people with disability, as well as those who support and care for them. I'm part of SBS Access, which is one of a number of our staff advisory groups. They're sponsored by members of our executive team, and so they have a direct influence on organisational policy. So our team is currently working on an internal disability action plan for 2021, and that's something that we're doing again in partnership in this case with the Australian Network on Disability. There's always more to do, but this year we've been pleased to have, for example, designed and launched a reasonable adjustments policy and process and embedded that into our recruitment practices, and introduced captioning to our internal events and accessibility options for our internal training materials and videos. Importantly, from 2019 to 2020, the percentage of staff at SBS who feel comfortable to share with the organisation that they have a disability has grown from 2% to 4%, with an additional 5.8% who identify as having a chronic condition, illness or injury that requires adjustment in the workplace. And I think that really demonstrates the importance of creating a culturally safe workplace for people who live with disability. So in closing, I wanted to really reinforce that we're proud of the steps we've taken, personally, especially in audio description, but we do know that increasing inclusion is an ongoing process. And we're really grateful for the engagement with the community because we're learning a lot as we go. Thanks, Jackie.
Thanks, Michael. It seems we're still having some technical issues with the video. I'm just wondering, and I'm putting you on the spot here, but is it potentially possible that we could put that on the Accessible Arts website for people to come and have a look at after the fact?
Yeah, I'm more than happy to check. There's often rights issues with these things, content rights, where you may have something at an event, but let me have a check and we'll get
Thank you. No, that'd be great, because I think it would be great for all of us to see it in person. An example, if we haven't had the opportunity to use audio description through viewing the current ABC or SBS programs. Michael, there is one or two questions here. Again, we'll leave these to the end for you, but I did have one. You referenced that SBS is working towards 18 hours of audio described content. Is there an ambition to do even more in the years to come? And how, it's another question putting you on the spot, how is that going to work with potential limitations of funding? And what could we do as a sector and people with an interest to ensure there is broader uptake of audio description across mainstream media?
Yeah, so the community expressed a preference for a minimum of 14, so that was part of the announcement that that's where we would start. But we always hoped to increase the hours, but it's of course very relevant to resources. So, we are able to do that. For example, if we acquire some content that may already have an AD track, then that's a little bit less expensive than if we have to author it for something like Hungry Ghost. So that's an example of somewhere where you can find some efficiencies to reinvest back into content. That's the pathway we have mapped out at the moment. We'll have to see where we get to at the end of that period. I think the Minister was interviewed again on Vision Australia Radio recently, and he noted that this funding will take both networks through to the end of our regular triennial funding cycle, and there'll be opportunities to talk about ongoing funding at that point, naturally. But I think I spoke recently at a Blind Citizens Australia event and was asked a similar question. And I think what the community can do is really consume the service, give us feedback on the service, and find ways to demonstrate its value. I know, as I mentioned in my presentation, that it was a service that had been anticipated for some time, and I'm sure the peak bodies and others will develop ways of capturing from their audience, from their members, some evidence of the value of it. And I think it's always persuasive when it comes to those discussions about the future.
Yeah, terrific. I heard that something that Blind Citizens had been advocating for over 20 years. So change takes time, but it's fantastic to have taken this step forward. Look, you referenced SBS's increased recognition of people with disability within their workforce, which is great to hear, and there's always more to be done. But I think that's a great segue into our next speaker, who's Naz Campanella, who's a Disability Affairs reporter from ABC. Naz, your experience as a journalist and now leading ABC's increased focus on reporting issues of importance for and of people with disability is an example of what we'll hopefully see more of in journalism and the broader media over coming years. Could you tell us a little bit about your background and the journey you've taken in your career so far? And as a valued employee of the ABC, what is the ABC doing to increase workforce participation and employment of people with disability?
Thanks, Jackie, and thank you to everyone. Can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am today, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you also to Sacha and Michael for their presentations so far. Feeling, I'm always quite hopeful about where we're going. I'm an eternal optimist, but hearing some of that straight off the bat was just brilliant and really puts all of the work that we are all collectively doing into perspective and makes me feel even more hopeful than I already was. So first of all, a little bit about my audio description. How could the person who is vision impaired forget to do audio description? So I am a woman with dark brown shoulder length hair. I am sitting in a room with an orange background and I am wearing, I'm all in turquoise today, turquoise sort of necklace with matching dress and cardigan as well. So a little bit about my background. I have lived experience of disability. I am totally blind and I also live with a condition called Charcot-Marie Tooth or CMT. It is a neurological condition which impacts my muscle tone, balance and sensitivity and prevents me from reading Braille. So I guess for me, my career really started out, I did a university course in journalism and then bounced around as an intern for several years from both print, radio, television and magazines, doing everything from kind of making coffee right through to interviews and finally publishing articles. I found it really hard to find work when I first started. It was quite a depressing process, lots of job interviews, and I usually got an interview because I had done so much unpaid work experience, and so I had a really great CV, great portfolio of published work. But I guess when it came to the job interviews, I found that there was really quite a terrible attitude towards disability and these low expectations and poor perception of, I guess, the capabilities that people with disabilities had. And so I faced quite a lot of resistance, didn't get anywhere for a long time. But then I was really lucky to finally be given one of the ABC cadetships in 2011. And I think the really different approach that the ABC took was that they saw me first and foremost as a person with a journalism degree and potential. And so when I got into the workplace, for my bosses here at the ABC, it was really about identifying what was it that I needed to do my job like everybody else. And so that was in the capacity of organising technology and orientating me around the various parts of the newsroom and office building that I needed to access independently, providing me with the mentoring and support that I needed in order to go about my job and learn how to be an independent and good journalist. And so I was not stopped from going out and into the field, reporting on all kinds of stories, from courts to sports, did a bit of time in politics and even some finance. So a really well-rounded experience in the Sydney newsroom for the first year, and then I was sent off to Bega on the New South Wales far south coast for a 12-month stint as a regional reporter, where again those really good supportive structures were put in place, the orientation and mobility, the assistance with finding accommodation, a place to live that was in walking distance from the office, assistance with making sure that I was able to delve into new areas, not just reporting, but also sub-editing stories and producing bulletins and reading bulletins live to air. It was a brilliant training ground, and I wasn't stopped or I was allowed to thrive in those environments that I was put in and given the support structures to do that. And so from then I spent 7 years newsreading at Triple J, which was a real dream come true for someone in their early 20s, reading to an audience of 2 million young people in any given week. I still pinch myself that I was afforded that incredible opportunity to be at the helm of entertainment, education, and informing a brilliant and dynamic audience. But over the years, of course, from my personal experience, but also reading and consuming and listening and to media all across the world, I have realised that very little had changed when it came to portrayal of people with disability, the types of stories that were told and the amount of stories that were told. And so I really wanted to shift that and have a real impact in that space. And so an opportunity came up for the National Disability Affairs Round, and I feel incredibly privileged that I am in a position where I get to, I have direct access to this incredible community of 4.4 million Australians living with disability, and they are helping inform, the stories that need to be told, the way they need to be told, and I am supporting them to elevate their voices and tell those stories in the way they see fit. And in turn, I guess really shaping the way that those stories are told. And for too long, those stories were told about people with disability rather than by people with disability. And I'm really proud that I'm helping to shift that now on a huge level. But outside of that, obviously, the ABC has introduced, especially with COVID, has introduced an Auslan interpreted bulletin every Sunday. We have live captioning on a lot of our programming. We have also, like SBS, introduced the audio description, which I'm so proud that we're doing that. And we've also just started, I chair a employee-led group called ABC Inclusive, and that is made up of employees with lived experience of disability and also supportive allies across the organisation. And together we are focusing on improving, the targets that we have around employment of people with disability and developing, new sort of recruitment strategies around that, and really trying to better reflect this community of Australians in a way that I guess hasn't been done before. And we're really proud to be at the forefront of that.
Thanks, Naz. Look, I think you've touched on it, but given your experience, would you like to discuss more about the media's ability to significantly influence an audience perception of people with disability and our capacity for social participation and, importantly, employment? Should the media be doing more to exert a positive influence? And do you have any suggestions on how they could go about doing this?
Look, I think first and foremost, having a role like mine elevates the idea of disability on a mainstream scale. My face is one that really hasn't been seen in the capacity of a reporter in the way that I guess I go about my role now. And it's really around the way we tell these stories. Stella Young coined the term inspiration porn. And it is so true that that is the way that stories have been told for so long. And I think for me, it's about going to someone with lived experience of disability and saying, let's work together to tell this story. What can I do to support you in this way? And what do you need to tell your story? And it's about putting voices out there that the Australian public might not have seen, heard before, and opening up their minds to the idea that someone who is nonverbal can still have their story told. We just think about it, we work with them to make that happen. And it's about changing the way those stories are told. So for too long, it's been all about telling the stories about people with disability. And for a long time, it's those miracle stories. And for me, it's really about taking those stories and saying there are a bunch of stories out there that show that people with disability are living active, positive, incredible lives like the next person. And it is a responsibility of ours to make sure those stories are told.
Absolutely. Thank you. You did quickly reference COVID earlier, but do you have any recent experiences when you've gone about recent reporting during COVID that demonstrate how we've had to develop a more flexible approach to remote working or engaging with people, and how accessible technology has facilitated this? And furthermore, hopefully that we can adopt this going forward.
Yeah, look, I need to acknowledge that COVID-19 for a lot of people with disability has meant, for some people, more isolation, and for others, for some it's more isolation. It's been a time where a lot of people in the disability community live with comorbidities. So it's been a very stressful time for those people who are increasingly worried about their health. Chronic illness is something that a lot of people live with, and very early on, there were lots of messages around how COVID-19 would only impact the elderly. Well, no, there are lots of people with disability who are young and who live with chronic illness, and they were very susceptible to catching COVID-19. So there was a lot of stress around that, and very valid stress and concern around that. But what I will say is that I do think COVID-19, in a sense, has shone a light on what people with disability have been saying for years, and that is that we need more flexible approaches to work, that you can work from home, that you can Skype in or Zoom into a meeting rather than getting somewhere physically. And I think for me in my reporting, I've noticed this because not only in the stories that have come out, we've done stories about how people in regional and remote areas living with disability who were not able to attend social events before because of geographical distances. Now, because of the virtual world that we've all become accustomed to, they are able to actually hop on and take, to be a part of those events for the first time. And it's meant in some cases that I've been able to reach out to certain people and say, you don't even have to go anywhere. You can just open up your laptop. We'll talk to you through that. We'll help you frame everything up. We'll tell you, put head up, down, left, right, whatever it needs to be. We will support you to be in our TV story. There are other cases where we've, for example, not been able to go into people's homes, especially in Victoria because of the recent strict lockdown process that they had. And so it was about working with my producers here and with people with disability and their families to say, let's help you film your own footage and be a part of that story because we are not able to come into your home and do it with you. And so I think in some small way, I think we've given people new skills, but also it's been an opportunity where we've been able to access people who we might not have before, and we're thinking differently about that.
Absolutely. I realised you need to duck off in a minute or so, but we do have one question that follows on from you talking about how encouraging people to provide their own stories and share their experiences. How would people who've joined us today be able to get in contact with you with potential stories or people they'd like for you to meet?
So I'm either on Instagram, which is at Naz Campanella, which is a really good way to get in touch, but also through the feedback forums here at the ABC. I try and respond to every email that I possibly can. I make myself quite available to the community because this is the coalface. You are my, you are the stories, you are the contacts, and I want you to be a part of this process. This is not just my round and my stories. This is the entire community's round, and I want everyone to be a huge part of it. So please get in touch.
No, this wasn't actually so much of a question, but just a thank you for sort of sharing your experience and what you're doing, advocating for our community. So probably on that note, we do recognise you need to head off. So thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And personally, I'm very grateful for what you're achieving for our community out on the ABC on a daily basis.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this incredible panel today.
Thanks so much. Okay, now I have some good news just to go back. It appears we have hopefully worked out the technical glitches with the program or the snippet that Michael provided, which is audio described and closed captioned. We're going to have another go, seeing if we can view that, and hopefully we will be able to. And then we'll move on to answering some of the questions that have been posed in the Q&A. So fingers crossed this works.
When we found out Hassan had been married, I told her to get away from him.
Sinabi ko sa kanya na bumiwalay siya sa kanya.
Tom!
Tom strides up a ramp carrying a bag.
Hey, handsome.
Tom puts down his bag. They quickly kiss. Then they throw their arms around each other for a tight, emotional hug.
Let's have a very big round of applause for Regina.
Kevin claps emphatically, and Regina steps up to the podium with a nervous smile. Kevin's hand is a little shaky.
The audio tactile pedestrian button was invented in which state?
With a serious frown, Regina lowers her gaze. Kevin waits for her to answer.
New South Wales?
Correct.
Kevin shakes with excitement and punches the air.
Regina, you scored a 15 out of 15. Congratulations.
Regina grins and Kevin looks thrilled. He holds out her hand and Regina high-fives him as she makes her way up the stairs.
Okay, terrific. Persistence pays off. So thank you, Michael from Accessible Arts, for troubleshooting, and thank you, Michael Coonan, for providing that for us today. We might now move on to a few of the questions that have popped up in the Q&A. And the first one is for Sancha, and it's a technical question about what were the microphones that you were speaking about that people could use at home for interviewing?
Oh, right. Here's me saying I wasn't a technical person to you, Jackie, yesterday. I'm very happy to provide the information to Michael of both the headphones and microphones as part of whatever wrap-up he might be doing, Accessible Arts might be doing after this.
Thank you. And whilst you're providing information to Michael, would you also potentially be able to provide a link or a reference to the document you called? I think it was called something like Not Going Back to Normal. I think you referenced that document. There's been a request for that link.
Yes, yes, I will. It's comes from the UK, but I will find that again and provide that information to Michael. Yep.
Thank you. And Sancha, we have another one for you, very popular today. This is a question about volunteer aspect of 2RPH, and it's great, great service, but why is it volunteer based? And is there a chance to fund readers so their time and skill is truly valued? Is it potential for a volunteer system for an accessible accessibility service, does it perpetuate the charity model of disability?
I'll just take the first part of that question first. So the organisation, yes, is a charity, but it's also volunteer-based, and that is how the national network in each of the states has been developed. It's a good question, and in fact, for a couple of our programs, we have started to pay our presenters. I think there's two things here. One is that in setting up the organisation, it probably wasn't seen, the volunteering element was probably certainly not seen as perpetuating the charitable model of disability, but rather giving an opportunity to enable people to volunteer and to use their considerable skills in terms of reading. And that is certainly not to be sneezed at when you see what the volunteers bring in their education to their role here. But, you know, it's an interesting topic for discussion of our organisation to be considering whether we can go forward in new financial models and to be paying people to do the work. But I do think we have to perhaps separate out the opportunity to volunteer. Just because it's providing a service to people with disabilities doesn't necessarily mean that it's perpetuating that charitable model, but it's food for thought.
Thank you. And further question, and it comes off the back of, and you've already addressed sort of the funding challenges, but this question references the deaf community and that there is no regular, reliable access to news programs in Auslan. It says that the ABC has recently begun providing a 30-minute update once a week, which is great, but obviously inadequate in quantity. As you've recently highlighted, access to the news is vital for everybody, including the deaf community, to allow everyone to access their human rights and activate their citizenship. I wonder if it may be other places the deaf community could go to get access for news.
Yeah, look, interesting, and it's something that I've been aware of in my time here, and I think maybe, well, one piece of recent experience I've had is that through Activated Arts, we have just subscribed to a transcription service to have that first program transcribed, and there is a cost to that. Now, there's not an argument with that cost, but in providing many of the other services, we don't have to pay in that same way. So there's an inequity there immediately, and that somehow needs to be addressed. So I don't have the answers to that, other than for our organisation to be perhaps talking to deaf organisations for the deaf, and maybe other media organisations, to see if there's any kind of partnership that we can develop, or whether we go back and utilise our volunteers to transcribe at no cost some of our programs. So there's a cost issue, but there's also what is being done in this space, what is the most efficient, what would the deaf society and the deaf community like us to be providing. But our limited experience has been that it's an additional cost, which again is inequitable.
Absolutely agree. Now, this next question is actually for Michael Coonan, relating to audio description. And Michael, it's more about sort of the technical side, and you may or may not be able to answer this for us, but question is around the age of television sets and which ones can and cannot use audio description.
Yeah, thank you. It can vary set by set, both whether the capability is there, and then within a brand, different models and the age of the TV. In general, the TVs that we tested and that are listed in our instructions on our website are generally looking back around 5 years, but I have an older television than that, and it works on mine. So it can vary, but I did put in a direct answer in one of the chat streams the details for our phone number, and we're happy for people to call up and we can work through with them if a particular TV set has the language settings that can be adjusted to receive it. But just to sort of recap, it does vary brand by brand, model by model, and that's one of the things that we need to work through with the broadcast solution.
Terrific, thank you. And similarly along those lines, as far as feedback direct to SBS, there has been some concerns expressed around sort of the quantum of closed captioning availability. And is that feedback line the appropriate channel to sort of contact you or others at SBS to talk about how frequently captioning is available, and particularly during this time of COVID?
Yeah, by all means, we're always open to audience feedback. And I mentioned how valuable it's been in the launch of audio description. I've got an audio description specific email address. There are others out there on our website, but I'm sure if you email that one, it's find it. It's
so the audio description one should find its way through on closed captioning for you?
Yeah, so I guess the important thing to note about closed captioning is we have a legislative obligation, and our budget is constrained, so we do caption to that obligation. We, of course, aspire to do as much captioning as we can, and where, for example, a program might be coming to the main channel, which carries the greatest regulatory obligation, and it might start on demand, then would naturally caption it, and it'd be on all of those platforms. You know, we're constantly looking at technology that can make captioning more resource effective, and you know, we do like to do as much as we can, but we do focus on that legislative limit.
Okay, this next question is about audio description, but it might be interesting to hear, well really it's only you or Sancha who can provide feedback at this point, but this one is about the skills of audio description and how they can be developed within broader arts sector, i.e. non-verbal arts, dance, physical theatre, and how can audio description be provided as high quality as possible, capturing all the artistic richness, story, etc., as well as the accuracy and best practice delivery. We do know that there has been audio description provided in a number of sort of live events through Opera House and Sydney Theatre Company and a few other events that I'm not going to adequately name all of them, but is there anything you can add as far as developing the technical skill of audio describers?
I think there are a number of both industry and academic partners out there that are really interested in quality and Australian styles of audio description. So I think between, say, the UK and the US, the style of audio description can be quite different in terms of it being a bit more pared back in the UK and a bit more embellished in the US, for example. So there can be taste factors to be taken into account. Naturally, we would have service level agreements with our providers about quality. And at SBS, we developed SBS-specific style guide, really, for audio description. So you might have heard, well, the sound wasn't working at the start, but if Michael Hing came out of the ocean in that first part of the clip and it said Chinese Australian man walks out of the sea. And so, like, in another example, we had a program, Sunshine, which was set in the South Sudanese community in Victoria, and in a program like that, we'd say the South Sudanese Australian man did X, Y, or Z, rather than say African man. So there can be some quite particular styles. I think there's a lot of interest across providers and academics in, you know, making it the best it can be, and of course we want it to be that way too. So we've done both one-on-one focus groups through Centre for Inclusive Design, and we did an online survey. We had 180 or more respondents giving us feedback on our service, and we'd do that, say, on a periodic basis to make sure that, you know, the style, among other things, is meeting audiences' expectations.
Terrific, thank you. Well, they're all the specific questions we have at the moment, but given we have a few minutes, and Sancha, please feel free to say no, but you did talk briefly about activated arts. Are you comfortable providing us a little bit more information on that? Or alternatively, in lieu of Anthea's presentation, we could probably provide a link to some existing information on as well on the wrap up of today's session if you prefer.
Oh, well, there is a link now on Accessible Arts' website and one on 2RPH's website of the transcript and the podcast. So it is being podcast, which is exciting. It's a monthly program, and Anthea in her first program interviewed two artists. But the idea of the program is, as I mentioned, one, to employ a person with a disability. She will be interviewing artists with disability, And certainly Anthea has developed, there's been a lot of skill sharing and learning on her behalf, which is great. There is another element of the program, and that is not quite a what's on, but kind of a roundup, and this will evolve. But we are keen, or I am keen, for the program to also support and promote what is going on in across the arts sector. In terms of programs and shows that are coming up as well, because I think, you know, we talk about access to the arts, and you know that's for the audience, and we talk about arts development or the artist development, and that of course is essential. Of course, both those two things. But I think the next frontier is really to develop audience development, and that is so that people really start to follow artists as they would artists with a disability, as they would any other artist. And to do that, you need to know what's going on. And so the program will give, you know, a small amount of time to that. It'd be just lovely to have conversations about, you know, artists and entertainment and other things, and people to be saying, you know, I really love to see, I love Anthea Williams' work. You know, she just happens to be an artist with a disability. And that's, I think, you know, one of the next areas to forge in the whole arts and disability sector.
Absolutely, and I agree with your sentiments there, and hopefully we'll see over time a broader understanding and adoption of, as you say, championing and following artists with disability, as we've seen with the adoption of technology. As you referenced during your presentation, Anthea, technology, and as we see, Siri and audiobooks are mainstream tech that's adopted by everyone from a convenience standpoint, which originated from an accessibility standpoint. So hopefully, with the work of Anthea, yourself, broader adoption of audio description and closed captioning across mainstream media, and the work of our community, we will see more and more awareness and celebration of the talents and achievements of artists with disability. So I don't think we have any more questions from our participants from today. None are popping up in the Q&A or the chat room. Are there any last messages, either Sandra or Michael, you would like to leave us with today before we wrap up?
Okay, yeah, look, I realised I did actually just miss out a couple of, because my notes kind of got lost when I was sharing my PowerPoint. So I missed just a couple of points I would make, or suggestions, I should say, in terms of strategy. And there's an organisation called Media Diversity Australia, which mostly focuses on the called community. But I am in, you know, conversation with them, and they would be very interested to have a conversation with Accessible Arts and 2RPH and themselves around identifying, you know, potential partnerships or strategies that could be developed to progress this area of enabling people with disability to work, you know, as a journalist. And I think we also need to recognise that, you know, media is more than journalism. It's, you know, maybe it's the political satirist, it's the photojournalist, it's the researcher, maybe it's the media owner. You know, is the next packer going to be someone with a disability, you know, who owns, or the next, you know, owns media. So I think we need to think really broadly as well. Just to let people know that the RPH network across Australia is really reviewing how it's working and who it works for and the content, and really looking and working with the disability sector as we speak to overhaul completely its vision, and to with the view of developing a disability content hub. And where that material will come from will not just be the RPH broadcasters, but perhaps sharing information and programs across multiple platforms, including television, to multiple ages, and perhaps work that's done at the ABC and SBS and all sorts of, you know, even regional places would somehow find their way to this hub, and content made by disability services and people with disabilities as well would make their way to this hub. So just to let people know that that's, you know, it's embryonic stage, but it's under discussion. And I definitely think that there are alternative pathways for employment in the area of production. We mustn't forget production. Journalism and media is not all about in front of camera, and I really believe quite strongly in the opportunities for people who have learning disabilities and other things in the area of production and scheduling and editing. There is real scope. So I would just like to put that on record. And in terms of just advice, yeah, I'd like to leave people with perhaps two messages, and that is, one, always talk to people who are perhaps resistant to your ideas, because they are the people that you actually have to bring along. And by talking to them, you only hone your idea more specifically, and you can, because you need to hear their concerns, you need to hear their fear, and perhaps there are very good reasons why, you know, you can't have a decentralized festival. But maybe by talking to them and understanding those blockages and challenges, you can actually progress your idea to a point where you will in fact get it endorsed. So yeah, that's probably where I'll leave it.
No, thank you, Anthea. And it's about increasing the conversation. And as one of our attendees today has raised as well, and it has come up in your presentation and Michael's, and indeed with Naz as well, it's about the accessibility of essential services such as news, but also entertainment for our deaf community and those with print disabilities as well. And the more mainstream these technologies are available, and the more frequently closed captioning interpreters and audio description is available, the less barriers there will be for essential information and entertainment for people with disability. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge and your suggestions today. Michael, do you have any last words for us?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. And thanks again for this chance to chat. Sort of at the very specific end, by all means, if in relation to audio description, anyone in the audience has ideas about how to get the word out there, the schedule out there. For example, someone recently recommended we look into talking books and using the audio file we provide for BCA for that. So those sorts of really practical suggestions that people that have a lived experience can share with us are really valued for us. At a more general level, as I mentioned, you know, we're on a journey when it comes to becoming an employer that is as inclusive as we can be. And I just wanted to give a quick plug for our training programs. The SBS Inclusion Program looks at different types of diversity and is a service which provides training modules for employers across the economy, obviously not just for SBS. So that's something that I'd recommend looking into. Our aim there is, you know, our overall aim is social cohesion at SBS, and inclusion is so central to that, whether it's in relation to LGBTIQ+ or cultural and linguistic diversity, or indeed disability. And we have, you know, modules on all of those types of diversity. Thanks, Jackie. You're on mute.
Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes, but there was a question in the chat board as far as have there been questions raised that everybody can't see. Those are the ones that have come through the Q&A, and we've read out the ones that have come up. So if you do have any last minute burning questions, please ask them now. But also through Liz and Accessible Arts, if there are some questions you think of later on for our panellists, I'm sure all of us would be happy for Michael or Liz from Accessible Arts to reach out to us, and we can provide some follow-up detail if required. So I'll give 30 seconds for any last minute questions popping through on the Q&A or on the chat board if you'd like. Okay, we might wrap up there. I'd just like to thank Sancha and Michael and Naz in her absence for joining us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's tuned in and for the insightful and engaging questions. It's been a really informative and engaging discussion today, and one that hopefully will increase and improve the level of disability representation in the employment sector of media and journalism, but also within the broader arts sector. And as we've mentioned before, making sure that there is access to essential news services and entertainment. So thank you all very, very much for joining us today, and please keep your eye out on the Accessible Arts website for future ATAG events. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie.
Thank you all.